Hello folks, welcome back to Management 5804, Leadership and Technology-Based Organizations. I'm Dr. David Townsend. This will be lecture 3.2. And in this lecture, we'll spend a few minutes talking about disruptive innovations and the job to be done. And so the connection here that we want to make is looking at the challenge of divergence between the product offerings from well-run and even world-class incumbents in a particular industry with the underlying customer demand. And so we'll spend a few minutes talking a bit more about disruptive innovation, and then we'll talk about the emergence of this new framework, or the job to be done, as a way to think through how to frame up and conceptualize our products, right? As not as something to be sold to a customer, but something that the customer purchases to accomplish a particular job that they want done. And so again, this will help us understand where the divergence is happening, and gives us a roadmap either as an incumbent of a way to redesign or rethink our products and services, or for a new entrant, startup, or a company moving into a new industry. It gives us a way to think through new ways to compete with disruptive products. And so again, just by way of recap, we talked about the real challenge of disruptive innovation, in that it happens to companies that are not weak or inefficient or struggling, but it often happens to companies that are world leaders, right? Companies that are at the top of their game, but face, and in some ways are blindsided by new offerings that, many ways are worse off. They're not making the customer better, but they appeal to some specific need or want that people at the fringes of the market have, that aren't being met by the incumbent's products. And so again, they seem to come out of nowhere, but there's a particular pattern here that creates this innovator's dilemma. And so you could be running your company brilliantly over the short run, but over the long run, you fail to see some of the specific things happen at the fringes of your market that create some underlying problems for you and continue to move forward. And so we also kind of use the example of Blockbuster and Netflix as a way to kind of puncture a hole in this notion that Netflix by itself was able to supplant Blockbuster. And to be clear, neither Blockbuster nor Netflix was entirely successful early on in catching the wave of streaming video. But one of the things we'll talk about in future lectures is this notion of dual transformation. And had Redbox not come along to cut out the leg that Blockbuster was standing on, so to speak, in order to adapt to this new streaming world, perhaps Blockbuster could have been successful. So neither Netflix nor Redbox by themselves were purely disruptive, but collectively both of the companies, along with other trends and other issues, combined to disrupt Blockbuster, which, again, for many of us, that's how we rented movies when we were children if we lived here in the United States. I mean, this was the sort of dominant player. And now Netflix has turned into this massively global brand. But as the case talks about, they're facing some of their own challenges of potential disruption. And so the story is much more complicated than this simple notion that Netflix was able to ride the streaming wave to supplant Blockbuster, right? Other things happen, and again, it was kind of this dual attack from both sides that undermined Blockbuster's dominant position. And so we highlighted this really briefly, but again, this is challenging some of this notion that incumbent companies themselves are just incompetent, and that's why they go out of business. And so everybody loves to talk about Xerox as an example of a company that completely missed out on the wave of GUI interfaces and personal computing. Again, the kind of famous story of Steve Jobs walking into the Xerox Park office in Palo Alto and seeing the mouse and seeing the keyboard and seeing the graphical user interface, and saying, okay, that's it. We're going to build our company or build our new Mac computers around these particular technologies. But again, everybody knows that Xerox had actually built those technologies in-house. But what most people don't understand is that the executives saw some of the value in these technologies, and they pitched it to their mainstream customers, but their mainstream customers simply didn't want it. It wasn't a technology that met the specific needs that they had at that particular stage, right? So mainframe computers shifting towards microcomputers or personal computers, their established customers from whom they generated most of their revenue didn't want these new technologies. And so Xerox continued to double down on sustaining innovations to improve their incumbent product offerings. But Apple and other new companies were able to form and explore some of these new markets, largely through trial and error to create this kind of new PC microcomputing wave. And then that allowed them to move continually up market. And then certainly the emergence of cloud computing, which everybody talks about as this brand new disruptive wave that Apple is facing. Well, for those of you who are older than I am or about as old as I am, you remember the mainframe days. I mean, I'm young enough that I'd never had to use a mainframe computer, but I remember going to NASA with my dad where he worked. And he's a physicist, and most of the calculations that they would run, they would have punch cards, and they would have access to mainframe computers and some of that technology. So it's kind of early versions, if you will, of cloud computing. But many of these companies, again, like Apple, were able to move up market and eventually kind of supplanted the way that companies organize their computing services. And so away went the mainframe computer, away went some of these large industrial-sized computational facilities, and kind of ushered the personal computing industry, which then faced its own set of challenges from mobile devices, and now mobile is facing some interesting challenges from wearable computing, and then certainly quantum computing, if it takes off, is probably going to lead to a new cloud era of computing. And so again, there's this cycle of creative destruction that's happening, but the underlying dynamics are never as simple as simply, this sort of inept managers not seeing the value. Many times they do, but it's just their current customers don't want it. And so you face the challenge of trying to figure out how to appease your mainstream customer base and respond to these new opportunities that are emerging at the fringe of your market. And so the incumbent's response, right? There's a couple different opportunities that incumbents have to deal with. And this will really encompass a lot of the work that we'll discuss throughout this semester. And so, one of them, as we'll talk about in a lot more detail later, is trying to affect the growth rate of a market so it grows fast enough to benefit a large company. And the Apple Newton in particular was an interesting example of this because, we all laud and praise Steve Jobs' brilliance to see the opportunity in the iPod and the iPad and the iPhone. But again, most of that technology was developed, or much of the technology was developed with the Apple Newton, which was a product that was there before Steve Jobs even came back from his stint at Next Computers and Pixar. And I love the quote here, right? Because he basically just said, if Apple was in a less precarious position, he would have figured out how to make the Apple Newton work. But he said it's good technology. There was some challenges with mismanagement. I'll skip the cuss word there. But he shut it down and freed up some good engineers. And then they took that technology and later moved it to the iPhones and the iPad. And so this kind of failure of this product that was released too early before the market was really ready was at the heart of this challenge. And so this is really difficult for companies to try to ramp up the growth of a market before it's ready. And again, there's a sequence of attaching products to specific customer needs and wants and preferences across the technology adoption lifecycle. And sometimes there are ways that you can affect the overall rate of diffusion, but you have to kind of tackle the problems in sequence in order to move effectively through it. And as we talked about a bit with the Google Glass case, one of the challenges Google had is they tried to rush the process. And so they had a product that was trying to appeal to too many customer segments at once, innovators, early adopters, and mainstream. And because of that sort of muddledness, the Google Glass product itself never took off. Now we're seeing some evidence that wearable computing is about to go into full gear again. Apple is rumored to have a release almost finished of an actual glass type product. Google is re-releasing Google Glass for industrial applications, and so I think we might see a reboot of the wearable computing industry, particularly around augmented reality glasses and other types of devices. And so again, maybe the timing is more right, and we'll talk more about timing later in the semester, particular to this specific issue. Right, another challenge incumbents have is you can wait till the market is large enough before entering, and I think this is one of the interesting questions with Apple, right? And so instead of following Google into this augmented reality space before the market was ready, in the book we'll highlight some challenges of waiting, but Apple waited, and the question is, was it really that terrible of a strategy? And I think the answer is no, right? And I think Apple may be much more successful with an augmented reality device because they've waited until certain enabling technologies and some other factors were at play. Right. The other thing is, match organization size with the size of the market. And so this is the preferred strategy in the book that we'll talk about. So there's lots of different ways to do this. Apple with the Beats acquisition is a great example of that. But then you also can see, and we'll talk about this much more with Ford and the Ford Mobility division. And so some recent acquisitions actually of even a former student of my program at NC State. Their company was just bought by Ford Mobility for, I think, $1.5 billion, Translock. And so the Translock guys are now wrapped into Ford, but then Ford decided to spin them out into the Ford Mobility LLC. And so we'll kind of tackle this question in particular of how large incumbents deal with this problem of dual transformation. And again, this is something we'll highlight in the coming weeks. But the jobs to be done framework is our main focus here. Right? And so this specific framework, as the readings highlight, is looking at the intersection between disruptive innovation and jobs to be done. And we talked about the divergence between the investments in sustaining technologies to improve your products and services as an incumbent, right? So you're using the pace of technological change to radically or sometimes dramatically improve product offerings, but the underlying demand of what that customer wants from that product, right, there starts to be a divergence. And so the jobs to be done framework highlights what the market is looking for, right? What do they want the product to be able to accomplish specifically, and is the sort of underlying rationale for why they buy it. And so that intersection between the two is, if you're an incumbent, this is what you have to balance, is improving the product but making sure it's well specified and meets the specific needs of customers in order to eliminate some of these particular challenges. And so how do we define the job, right? Well, is the jobs atlas here, so know where you're starting from, right? So understand what stakeholders are looking to accomplish and what they prioritize. So what are the main drivers of success in this mainstream industry? And then determine the current approaches and experience where there's specific pain points, right? So are there aspects of your product or service that are making it difficult for people to consume those products or to utilize those services? And then it's looking at the destination and identifying roadblocks, right? So what are challenges or difficulties that you're creating for your customers to make it difficult for them to continue to engage? And so are you over-engineering your product to a degree that you're leaving yourself susceptible for somebody to come along with something much more refined, much more focused, and much more simple? And just to be clear, what I mean by refined is not that the product functions better, but the product has a simpler set of features or functions built into it. And so then it's balancing the price performance trade-off, right? Fundamentally, it's balancing the value proposition. And so you're able to continue to drive success by aligning what your product can do for someone with what their expectations are. And we'll talk more about this when we deal with this question of the elements of value, how to actually construct a value proposition in compelling ways. But the specific way, kind of goes through this notion of understanding what the job to be done is. And again, people don't buy a product solely based on its price. They don't buy it solely based on its features. They buy it because their investment of cash or investment of resources is to accomplish something, right? They're focused on the functional value that that product creates. And so it's important to keep those things aligned. And so again, to define the job, we've got to look at what the product itself requires from our customers. And so on this y-axis, we look at the degree of behavioral change required. And then we, across the x-axis, we look at the increasing degree of product change involved. And so the products themselves that are the most successful at staving off disruption, or conversely, the ones that eventually become the most successful at being disruptive, are the ones that have a high degree of product change, right? So it could be a radically different innovation, but requires very little behavioral change on the side of on the behaviors of our customers, right? So we're balancing this technological versus this demand side uncertainty. And so again, we're minimizing the amount of change we require from our customers, but we're giving them radically new ways to accomplish those jobs to be done. And again, decreasing degrees, so high levels of behavioral change with a product that has very little difference between incumbent products on the market is going to be a sure failure. The long hauls are ones that require a fair amount of behavioral change on the customers and require a significant amount of product change. That's when our demand and our technological uncertainty are kind of at their peak. And then easy sells are things that are very limited, but in terms of product change, but have a very low level of behavioral change required. And that's oftentimes where you're competing on price, or you're competing on a few different features. But to really stave off and to deal with this threat of disruption, smash hits is really the fundamental thing and the place that we want to be. And by degree of behavioral change, this is really where we try to match what's expected from the customer segments in each stage of this adoption curve that we're going to tackle. And so smash hits themselves are going to change as you move through the adoption lifecycle. But again, it's because the product itself is being changed and adapted to the specific needs and wants of customers in those different segments. So overall, this jobs to be done framework, again, is managing what customers think that they want, or what they know that they want relative to the pace of changes that we're introducing to the product. And sometimes our success in continuing to move mainstream and continuing to refine our products to the point that no one can compete with the exact product that we have in the market because it's so well specified, it's so well constructed. But if it's far outpacing what our customers want, that's going to leave us very susceptible to changes happening at the fringes of our industry. But it's important to note that there's always going to be dissatisfied customers. There are always going to be people at the fringes of the market who aren't happy with the products that we're currently offering. So they're always looking for something new, right? There's innovators and there are small segments of early adopters who are always unhappy with the status quo. That's perfectly fine. The real challenge becomes when you start the disruptive innovator starts to be able to get closer into diffusing across a broad set of early adopters and starts to get close to moving into the mainstream. This is somewhere electric cars are getting close to this. And so some of these discussions are going to occupy our time as we move forward and we think about how to position electric vehicle technology effectively to either to go mainstream, or for a legacy auto manufacturer like Ford or GM or Toyota, how do we defend against this threat? But next, the specific thing we'll tackle is a Netflix case. And Netflix, again, everybody talked about them as a disruptor. We challenged that narrative and said it was much more complicated. It was really the combined effort of Netflix and Redbox that led to the disruption of Blockbuster. But now Netflix itself is facing some really stout challenges. And so we'll get a chance to unpack those issues within that case.